Yeah, thanks, Tomo, and thanks first of all to Central Queensland Uni for running the media for Australian Intercollegiate Meat Judging Association. It's been fantastic, and welcome everyone to our fifth webinar this year, which is a small replacement for our conferences we hold, but I think it's a great addition to what we do because we can increase the reach and the impact that the time these presenters give us and the reach of what they're telling us about different topics that affect the meat industry. So thanks for coming along. For those of you that don't know, Australian ICMJ is basically in place and funded heavily by MLA and AMPC to inspire and develop future professionals in the red meat industry. So a lot of these students go everywhere across the value chain, and so it's fantastic to have that support of the industry and MLA and AMPC. Our two presenters today I'm very excited about. We've got David Johnston, who's the Principal Research Scientist at the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit here at UNE in Armidale. Jono, as we all know him across industry, is a Bachelor of Rural Science graduate and then did his Masters here and went off to the US at University of Georgia to do his PhD in genetics, and has had a big impact through all the beef CRCs 1, 2 and 3 here in Australia, and now is maintaining that impact through, of course, the project called Repronomics, funded by MLA and supported heavily by industry, which has been running since 2013. So it's exciting to get a bit of an update on that and what some findings from that. And our other presenter today is Bec Burnham. Bec was a 2019 Nuffield Scholar, and many of you will know Bec from her big inputs around industry on different committees. Sounding board for most people, I think, Bec, and I see you're involved in something else for students on Friday, so good on you. Bec's Nuffield Scholarship was looking at selection techniques and technologies which will help increase the rates of genetic gain, obviously with a focus on the northern industry in Australia. And she's keen to implement the findings from that study into her commercially tropically adapted cattle that she's got between Thangool and Augathella. Did I pronounce that correctly? No idea. And also at the on the family Boogle cattle seed stock operation, which is at Eidsvold, where they've been breeding measured Brahmans and Charbres for more than 40 years. And prior to this, Bec was at Melton Grazing, which is a commercial operation north of Alpha. And I first met Bec in 2011. We sat in the meeting rooms at Sydney Airport, and John Thompson and I had created the MSA Index, and Bec was one of the first producers that we ever ran that data across to see whether that makes sense. And then from that day, MLA said, oh, well, this looks pretty sensical. We should implement the MSA Index in the industry. So Bec has been a sounding board for industry for many times. So without further ado, I'll hand over the screen to Jono. So Jono's going to do his presentation, then followed by Bec, and then we'll have question time at the end. So if you've got questions, you can use the chat function down the bottom or through to Tomo or to everyone. Jono.
Should be good to go. Is that everyone? Are you seeing that, Michael?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Righto. Thanks for the info, Peter. Welcome everybody to this seminar. And as you can see, it's rumps and humps, eggs and pregs. Can we breed for both in Northern Australia? So this is a topic I came up with after consultation with the group, and I think it's going to be very relevant to a lot of producers, but also to the crew at ICMJ. So what I want to do today is just set the scene, go through some genetic concepts for heritability, correlations, EBVs with this context. And I'm drawing very heavily on beef CRC, Repronomics, Brahman Breed Society bin, Northern bin projects, probably 20 years of research in the north. I've tried to pull it together into about 4 slides, and it's coming from about half a dozen or more scientific publications. So everything I present today, people can get their hands on if they need to follow up. For a lot of the talk, I've sort of tried to focus a little bit in on Brahmans for the parameters, but certainly these concepts work in other breeds in the tropics and also has relevance for the southern industry as well. I want to go through some challenges and possibilities, and I've sort of pitched the talk today for the students so that they get an understanding of what we're talking about with genetics. So I'm going to sort of fill in the genetic basis of what we're talking about, and then I'm going to rely very heavily on Bec to come back with insight from an industry perspective from her experiences. So we'll kick off straight away. And I want to pose, do we have a breeding dilemma when we have this Brahman bull sitting in front of us? When he goes out, he's going to produce a lot of steers that end up with carcass and meat quality. But equally so, for every steer he puts on the ground, he's going to put a heifer. And we expect that heifer then to carve out as cows. And we want to make lots of money here, and we want to make lots of calves here. So the big question is, for these sort of traits that are controlling carcass and these traits that are controlling whether we have lots of calves, what is the role of genetics? So do we have a genetic basis for these? And can we have good for both? Can we have carcasses and the cow? So that's what I want to really focus in on in my 15, 20 minutes. And think of it, can we have them tough on the outside and tender on the inside? And this is a quote that I took from one of our northern breeders when we were talking about this topic. And the first thing we can see is if we look at some data, we have lots of variation. So for these carcass and meat quality traits, we've got differences across projects, we've got differences across years, but you can also see we have big differences within kills for something like shear force, for IMF, for fatness. So we're seeing lots of variation within those kills for these carcass and meat quality traits. Equally so, if we look at female reproduction and we look at our data from beef CRC or repronomics, we can see traits like age at puberty. We see big differences across groups, calving rate, anoestrous interval in first calf cows, calving rate. But likewise, within those groups, we see big differences between individuals for something like age at puberty, from 300 days to 1,000 days. And so all this variation, we want to explore, what's causing it. And the big thing to look at here is that we can see that we have what we call our P is equal to G plus E. Very simply, the performance or the phenotype on an individual is the combination of the genetics it has and the environment. So half the genetics come from the sire and dam, and it's set at conception. We can't change it. So when bull meets cow, it's all over from when we talk about genetics. And then the rest of what we do with that animal is going to be the production system, the nutrition, the health, the management. And when we're talking about carcass traits, processing environment, post-slaughter environment, etc. And so that's what we're faced with. And if we look at the genetics, this is what we predict is this genetic component of the performance with EBVs. But if we want to make improvement across the board, then we've got to do selection for the genetics and innovate in terms of our production system. And we've got to be doing both simultaneously. I'm going to pull apart the genetics bit, but I'm going to pose a question at the end. How do we actually generate improvement for the industry, particularly for these carcass and meat quality traits? So how much is genetics? Well, we estimate this with what we call the heritability. So for a trait, it can be between 0 and 100%. 0 is under no genetic control. 100% would mean that the trait is under complete genetic control with no impact of the environment. So I've just pulled together a whole lot of numbers here to give us a bit of a ballpark on what we see for carcass and meat quality traits. And just to give us an indication, I've summarised all those papers and come up with ballpark estimates that a lot of these carcass traits are sort of 30 to 40% heritable, but you can also see that the meat quality traits, yield, shear force, tenderness, are also heritable, but there are some traits like pH and butt temperature that are basically not heritable at all. Likewise, our cow traits, if we look at our cow traits, we can have some of the traits to do with calving ease and birth weight, and you can see that they are also heritable, but we have traits to do with age at puberty and estrus interval. They are strongly heritable, and traits to do with adaptation. Equally so, we have heritability estimates to show that they are under genetic control. So you can see immediately, can we have both? Well, the answer is yes. We have traits in both the cow and the carcass that are under genetic control. So we can use those and produce EBVs, where we use the record, the management, the pedigree, and a BLUP statistic that uses those known heritabilities to predict differences. And this is what we have in the breed plan system, where we have EBVs for all those traits, including, importantly, traits for carcass and meat quality, and also for reproduction. So what does this allow us to do? Well, we can describe genetic differences. And I've just got a couple of slides here to show that if we've got these two Brahman bulls, without knowing anything about them, you wouldn't have much clue that this bull on the right is plus 47 for carcass weight. The bull on the left is minus 24, where we would predict that we would get a 36%, 36 kilo difference or heavier carcasses from the bull on the right than the bull on the left for progeny. So again, that's predicting differences in future performance of progeny. Likewise, eye muscle area, plus 11 minus 4, a 7 square centimetre difference in eye muscle area of these two bulls for their progeny at a 300 kilo carcass. For meat quality traits, we can do shear force, a measure of tenderness, and again, the bull on the right, a kilo less shear force in his progeny than the bull on the left. Equally so, our female reproduction, a lot of this work coming out of the beef CRC and repronomics, where we can show this bull minus 4.8 months, this bull plus 8 months, a 6.5 months difference in the average age of daughters of the two bulls at puberty when treated under the same management. And estrus interval, again, minus 57 plus 72, we have a genetic prediction that the daughters of these bulls, the bull on the right, will be 65 days shorter and estrus interval, that is to return to cycling, in his first calf daughters. So again, illustrating that the EBVs predict genetic differences in the progeny, and obviously some of these differences can be very large. Likewise, days to calving, our fertility EBV, again, minus 22 plus 17, 20 days shorter, which would show that the bull on the right will have a 20% higher calving rate of his daughters year in, year out, compared to the bull on the left. So if we see these differences in traits, the first thing is, well, how do we get a balance in those two traits? And the first thing is we have to have very clear breeding objectives. What are we trying to breed for? And that includes the genetics. What are our trait heritabilities? How much variation is there? And how much relationship is there between traits? Especially, is there going to be antagonism between traits if we're trying to select for one and change the other? The second thing is, what are our economic values of those traits? What's our production system? What's our market? What's our breeding system? Are we using terminal size, or are we keeping replacement heifers? And how long does it take to get those traits expressed? So we need to know both these things when we're trying to work out what is the balance of traits in a breeding objective. And for example, in market, why would we select for tenderness if the market is to grind all that beef? We don't need to waste time and effort in breeding if the production system is that everything is going to be ground into hamburgers. So what we want is the importance of each of these traits to the overall breeding objective. Now, importantly, in the north, we have to also remember we're working in tough production environments. Sometimes we get this and our environments change to this. So we're working with hot environments with variable feed, particularly low quality during the dry season. We're working with a lot of parasites, and so adaptation is critical. And obviously that's why we're working with Bos indicus genetics. So what we can look at is, if we're going to look at the importance of these traits for breeding, I've got an example here with the Brahman JAP-OX index, simply looking at the relative importance for breeding of the different traits that drive profit. And you can see that the #1 trait for profit is cow weaning rate. So the fertility of the herds is paramount to driving profit in terms of traits we should be breeding for. But equally so, you can see here that we do have the live weight, the dressing percentage, the saleable meat percentage. So these carcass traits are also important and constitute about 40% of this index. But equally so, if we put more emphasis on quality, if we had a quality market, if we were putting value on marbling, you would see that that percentage would go up further. So you can see in this slide, each of the traits is weighted depending on its economic importance and also the traits as to in terms of their genetics. So the important thing here is that some of these traits are correlated. And what we do in our genetic evaluations is we look at trait relationships. If we select for one trait, does it in fact change another? And we use what we call a correlation between -1 to +1. So we can have favorable relationship between traits, or we might have antagonistic, but that depends on actually the trait definition in terms of whether that's positive or negative. So I've just, again, tried to summarize hundreds and hundreds of numbers here for carcass traits and the cow traits. I've just boxed them into blocks and simply says, if we change carcass traits, what happens to the cow traits? And we've got the genetic correlations. So for carcass traits, generally, we see only low to moderate, and some are positive and some are negative with the cow reproduction. So in other words, we can change our carcass traits without having a great antagonism with reproduction. There are some of interest, and I've just put these out to the side that people can follow up on. Blue means a favourable relationship between retail beef yield and age at puberty, but in general, low. Whereas for carcass traits, between cow size, we see low to strong. And what we've got here is that carcass weight is positively correlated with cow size or cow weight. Low to moderate with calving ease, but again, we see a strong or moderate correlation between carcass weight and birth weight. Adaptation traits, low to moderate. And again, there are interesting ones there between fat and rectal temperature. But across the board, for carcass traits and cow traits, generally, there's no major antagonism except for the relationship between the weight of the carcass and the weight of the cow. And what we see here is if we plot high accuracy Brahman sires and just put their EBVs on a graph for birth weight and carcass weight, you can see that the high carcass weight bulls tend to also be the bulls that have high birth weight EBVs. And there's only a few in this bracket here which are above average for carcass weight and below average for birth weight. So you can see if we're going to have big carcasses, we've got to work hard to find ones that aren't going to also leave us cows out there that have big birth weights. Likewise, if we look at cow weight, we see the same thing, high carcass weight and cow mature weight. We again see these big bulls for carcass weight are also the same bulls that have big EBVs. And if we want to find these bulls that are below average, again, they're because of this positive relationship, there's fewer bulls that we can find that are below average for cow weight. But all these trait relationships, the other one is the meat quality traits. Again, just quickly through these, low to moderate with reproduction. There's a couple of interest here between colour. We have low to moderate with cow size, low to moderate with calving ease, and low to moderate with adaptation, with a couple here of interest. But again, across the board, if we want to improve these traits, we're going to only have moderate correlations with cow traits. So we can improve these and improve these at the same time without any major antagonisms. And if we use the EBVs and select all these heritabilities, all these correlations are built in. And here's an example of a genetic trend in a Hereford herd where they're making very good progress at 2 kilos a year But because they're weighing birth weights and the correlation is very strong between birth and 200, in fact, they're not changing birth weight across those 15 years. So again, with the use of EBVs, record both and select using the EBVs, those correlations and heritabilities are built in to the EBVs, which allows us to find bulls in the breeds because of the recording that's happening that are good for both. So here's a drought master bull that is very good for his carcass type traits in terms of carcass weight, IMF, shear force, but also very good for the female traits, lower birth weight and good days to calving. Likewise for the Santa, here's a bull also that is very good for carcass and also very good for females. We do have some bulls that are just carcass genetics. So here's a bull that's very good for carcass and meat quality traits, however, has high birth weight, high cow size, and very low days to calving. So this is the sort of genetics that you'd use in a terminal sire over another breed of females, probably a high fertility breed. Likewise, we've got bulls out there that are very good for cow genetics. Here's a bull that's exceptional for days to calving, low mature cow weight, low birth weight, but you can see has very poor EBVs for the carcass and the meat quality. So again, using a maternal program and crossbreed to get the carcass traits to these sort of genetics. So just to finish up, what are the limitations on carcass and meat quality data if we were going to select? We tend to be constrained to having designed progeny tests. Our measures are costly if we've got to do labs and consumer taste panel. We've got to do a lot of control pre-slaughter to make sure we don't have drafting and harvesting. We've got to do a lot of control post-slaughter to make sure we don't have trimming. We know what's happening with electrical stimulation, the quarter site, whether there's Spencer rolling, whether there's differences in temperature of the chiller. So all these things make it very difficult to get abattoir data. However, if we could use more commercial data where we can use genomic pedigree, we get over some of this progeny test. If we can get improved live animal ultrasound of IMF, DEXA yield, camera marbling, and live animal tenderness. So I put out some challenges there as an industry and recording to get better data. What else might we need? Do we need other traits for the genetic evaluation for our carcass traits? Do we need meat quality traits in terms of iron content, fatty acid profile? And likewise, our cow traits. Do we need to know more about body composition of our lactating cows, feed intake, adaptation, methane, etc.? So I think there's a challenge then from a scientific community. Do we have all the traits? If we're going to use genomics for these carcass and meat quality traits, I suspect we're going to need larger reference populations. And then we have to work out, should we be even bothering selecting for meat quality? Are there clear market signals? Do we know the traits? Do we know the economic values? Which would be the traits and how much change is possible? And I'm not going to address that now, but I think that's a separate follow-up, and some of Bec's insight will give us a clue to whether we should be in fact doing it in the first place. So just to finish up, we've got multi-trait breeding objectives. We can't just select for carcass, and we just can't select for fertility if we're going to make profit across the entire beef industry. We can't ignore that adaptation is critical to the north. We've got heat, we've got to look at cow size, we've got to look at that fat deposition versus carcass yield and tenderness, and we've got to understand further the genetics that are driving some of those areas. We've got to be looking at alternative measures. We've got to be looking for cheaper measures, easier measures, so that we can get more data into our genetic evaluations. We can't ignore that we always should be looking for non-genetic solutions. If we can be doing tender stretching, if we can be doing aging, then we increase that E bit of it, that we don't worry about the genetics so much, that we can fix tenderness by simply post-slaughter procedures that we do. And I think the challenge to the meat judging team is, if we've got high scoring carcasses, how does the industry produce more of them? What have we got to do such to fill the chillers full of those high scores? In other words, how do we get the right genetics added with the right environment to get the right phenotype? And to me, that's a real challenge. If someone is getting poor carcasses, how do we actually get them to get better carcasses? And I think that's something that is worth really following up. So just to come back to our breeding dilemma, I'm saying no, I don't think we have a breeding dilemma. We can breed them tough on the outside and have plenty of carbs and also tender on the inside. However, there's no free ride. We can't just do this and get this. We have to be recording both and selecting these bulls in commercial situations based on their EBV. They're going to perform both for the carcass and for the cows. So just to finish up with some quick acknowledgements on where this work is coming from, and obviously summarising a lot of research funded by MLA over nearly 20 years in the beef CRC, repronomics and Northern BIN, and the collaboration and cooperation of breed societies and breed in the north. And that's it for me.
Thanks, Tomo, and thanks for that insightful presentation. And I'm sure everyone's got some questions there. So just throw the chat now, and then we'll get to the questions after Bec. So Bec, if you could just load up. So if you've got any questions, type them in now, would be great. You'll just have to unmute yourself, Bec.
Bottom left, Bec. The bottom left.
Hello. That.
Yeah, you're good.
Hashtag data drought out here. I just dropped out. Sorry, Dave. I missed most of your presentation, trying to log back in. Yeah, good old Northern Australia internet. Anyway, thanks very much, Pete, for the introduction just before David. And thank you very much for the invitation to have the platform to share what it was I was lucky enough to learn last year with my travels with Nuffield. So just to fill you in, operation in Big Al cattle, and it's quite marginal eucalypt country in some of it, but there are some nice pockets of softwood scrub where you can see my nieces and nephews riding with grandpa up there. I'm very blessed to be a part of such a diverse family team that that communicate and get on well. So for that, I've been very thankful to collaborate with my brother with some of these things that I have learned. I guess I'm going to start off with an introduction of why I applied for a Nuffield scholarship and what led me to doing that. And I'm just going to share, there's some global insight, personal experiences about the beef of the future, what I saw, and I'm going to swap it off on Jono, and I'm going to go with eggs and pregs up first, because without them I can't analyse rumps and humps, and then just look at some measurement and modern technologies I found in my travel, and then the future. Is this all working all right?
Going well.
Yep. Excellent. I just wanted to check that I wasn't talking and being used. This is also an example of some of the cattle that we ran in the commercial operation when I was out west at Alpha for 16 or so years. So Pete had covered that, but really we'd covered off on a lot of grazing and herd management changes whilst we were at that operation. We reduced walking distance to 1 kilometre, implemented rotational grazing to ensure that we had a good rising plan in nutrition, and we looked at and we did change our timing of mating. So from these changes, we really noticed that we had less inputs and got more calves from the same amount of cows on the ground, had less bottle teats. And an exciting thing too was the improvement in our MSA index, which we were able to benchmark through my MSA at the time. Simultaneously, we'd also improved our markets. So we started Japox, we then went into just trading cattle, and then we stabilised the business. When MSA started up in 07, 08, we started selling through that and went into PCAS at the time, organics, and then went into Global Animal Partnership, which is like an animal welfare platform teamed with organics. We sold through processes that still measured our eating quality performance, though, because that was something we didn't want to take our eye off the boil. We wanted to ensure that we're heading in the right direction. In short, we had more profit from those farm management changes, but I did learn firsthand something that Jono exposed me to last year when I started my Nuffield travels. I thought it best to start in Australia, so I did a road trip down to Agbu and Armidale, and he spoke about the P equals G plus E. I didn't know what phenotype was, and yeah, it was all a learning curve for me. But in short, it was just, yeah, we want to breed an animal. Ben Hayes refers to it as a sack of DNA, and then the environment is just anything and everything else that can happen, which Jono went through before, so I won't go on with that. So this led me to why I wanted to herd and grazing land management in place, and then I really started thinking about the genetics we were introducing into the herd. Were they doing similar things in terms of management? Was I superseding the management I had? And then it was just that whole thing, bull buying ratio. So I wanted to make sure that we were heading in the right direction. And I just wanted to know that bull's genetic merit, if his heifers, were they actually going to conceive when we put the bulls out? Was the weaner bulls that I decided to select from them, were they going to have good % normal sperm? And even on to, were the steers going to grade well in MSA and continue improving our index, which we had done 6 index points through our management changes. And it just seemed like too far to wait to find out 3, 4 and 5 years later some of those bits of information. So the traits of interest to me were the ones that drove profit in our enterprise. And when I started thinking about it, I'm like, well, fertility, I actually can't look at it and really tell if that animal is going to be a fertile animal. I can't look at it and is it going to eat less and, give me good feed efficiency and yield, and then of course eating quality. How was I going to ensure that beast is actually going to improve our index and not take us in the wrong direction? Hence my Nuffield application. So I was extremely excited to be awarded a Nuffield last year. I thought I'd have to try a few times, but the beauty of it is that it's just farmers sharing knowledge with farmers. So last year, and because it's COVID year, I thought that probably go against share my trip around the world with you all, which is something we can't do at this point. So it's crazy to think that I travelled nearly 250,000 K last year. I went around the world twice. For those of you unfamiliar with Nuffield, there's 3 sections to it. So we had the contemporary conference in Ames, Iowa, and then we have sometimes 10 other scholars from every different country in the program. And then we've got an individual section which is focused on our actual research points. So here are the Australian 17 of us last year in Iowa at the World Food Prize Centre. Lots of countries and with all the interviews and places I visited and things I read and things I saw, just these issues continue coming up. World population boom, we're increasing by 81 million a year, and we need to produce more with less. That was like the overarching message everywhere I went. Whether it be a seed stock producer, a leading seed stock producer, or a scientist, they all said the same thing. So we're looking at different traits that they were measuring, such as feed efficiency, mature cow weight, And then we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions poll, animal health and birth weights when we get into animal welfare, and the consumer trust tied into the welfare, but also in terms of that consistency of eating quality, so that as a globe, as a world, we're working together as a beef industry to ensure really good positive eating quality or eating experiences for our customers. And the healthfulness one was a great one for Bos Indicus, as we've really got high levels of the right types of fatty acid, and iron levels also, as John touched on. So through genetics, I learned that we've got the opportunity to be proactive rather than reactive, but for how? It was where it got me to. All the time, we need to remember though that as beef producers, we still, to be able to achieve these things, need to be able to produce beef at a profit and maximum kilograms per hectare. So a question I ask, I said I have to put eggs and pregs first, because without them I've got no rumps and humps to analyse, but can you pick which of these beautiful maiden heifers is going to be the most profitable? Which one's going to conceive the earliest, breed year after year, and so began my journey. So I start off with some bison. This was in British Columbia, Canada. But I start here because it's -40 winters, and they had actually selected a line of Angus cattle also that could survive and thrive in this environment. So you can see here that we've got bale grazing happening through the winter. They're adapted and they survive. Then I'd go to another part of the world, Florida, and thankfully I wasn't on a horse this day, but they needed to be able to survive predation. So this was quite a crazy photograph to see, and yes, we did see gators when we were out checking some cows. Then we go to Kenya, and Kenya was just crazy in the fact that they had lion attacks, which they'd managed the environment through Maasai that would actually stay with the herd, but they also had a lot of predator theft in humans, would you believe? Not only in Kenya did they have that pressure, but they were also grazing in harmony with the other livestock, I suppose. So this is at Alpegida Ranch with innovative farming, and had $1 million out of their $7 million turnover. So now we go to South America, and I was lucky enough to go in the lowlands in Brazil, up in Mato Grosso do Sul. And this was a property called Fazienda São Bento, and it's a really good example of, they persisted with being a breeding operation, and they were best practice adopters. They took on all the right things, but they just got to a point where it wasn't profitable for them. They had huge predation issues, and as you can see, they'd lose 50% of their calf crop. So sometimes breeding wasn't an option in this respect. So the eggs and pregs, they actually chose to go into a trading operation. So it was just a really good example of choosing animals or operation structure to survive and thrive in your environment. So that led me on to Jacarezinho, which is in the east of Brazil. I have been wanting to go here for years, and I was so excited to catch up with the outgoing CEO or manager, Ian Hill, and he was literally leaving. So I met with him in Sao Paulo, but his English was impeccable. So it really gave me a good insight into this operation. It was a performance recording of over 6,000 calves a year. So it was really something to behold. However, weren't that interested in modern tech to help with that capture, because they had vaqueros. So they were quite a lot on farm to help with these time-consuming measurements. Now, I'm laughing thinking, can you understand this? Because that's how I felt when I walked in. So thank goodness for Arta, who was one of my GFP members. He was from Brazil and travelled the world with me for 8 months on our Nuffield tour. So he helped me to basically translate. Now, this is talking about SAPE. Now, SAPE, if we go on to the next slide, excuse my translations of someone who's good at, in Portuguese, and I've got it incorrect, but I feel that I've got the basic gist of this genetic evaluation. And it was special in the fact that it only retained animals that were in the top 20% of this special certificate that was given to cattle that were in the top 20% of the genetic evaluation. It was funded by the government, in which the government saw the importance of having cattle that were more efficient and more productive. So there's actually some tax deductions too for sales and things like that. But the most interesting thing is that only the top 1% of the 10% of males that are retained are able to be collected for semen. It also had a CPMU section to it, and this is, I hazard to say, but it's similar to the Santas in terms of classification, where it went through 4 different areas of physical or structural analysis, and that was also incorporated into EPDs. Now, it was something I had to learn, but EPDs was just similar to our EBVs in fact of like they're similar as in a tool to select cattle with. So I found that really interesting. Then from there, the cattle that did make the safe grade for that year, they actually get a physical brand of recognition, which I thought was really great in the fact of if you were to attend a bull sale, you'd know that that animal was in the top 10% of males for that year. So it was just a really quick, easy way to cut through some of the data that some of us do find quite overwhelming. So yeah, SAFE was an extremely interesting thing that I saw. It was interesting at Jacarezina. This is their measurements for in terms of phenotyping for technology weren't engaged, but they had engaged genotypes. And it's interesting because they were working on correlations with the CPMU or that classification system, and they were looking at the genomic relevance as well. So they were hoping to make that more objective, that measurement. Staying in South America, we went to the World Brahman Congress. So on that, we got to tour some different animal operations, and this dairy was an amazing dairy. Agro Alpha is the headquarters, and you can see there the cows, pretty good animal welfare with the scratches, but it was a 3-way cross, Holstein, Jersey, Brown, Swiss. And if they didn't have music played to them, they'd have 300 mil less milk that they produced. So there's an environmental factor that was, engaging more production. So I found that really fascinating. But also, when we got to the little calf pen, they'd been doing their intensive measurement, as dairies do, and have such a good opportunity to, and they were coupling that with genotyping to identify which of these calves would be suitable for their breeding program. So from all of this, I came back to understanding that those things didn't stand by themselves. The EPD or the phenotyping that was being done, the pedigree being recorded, and the genotyping that was being done actually all fed together to create like an EPD or EBV with more accuracy. So that was a big learning part of my trip. So Gardner Angus Ranch was fascinating in the fact that they'd been such early adopters of AI. And they'd adopted that in 1964, but didn't really experience any type of, I suppose, improvement in genetics until they started doing a genetic evaluation. And it was from here that they really experienced a big change. So it just showed the importance of using the tools. So Leachman's also had a strong focus on their herds breeding, but they also were looking at feed efficiency, and that was measured through GrowSafe units. And if you look at that slide, it's a ripper, a conversion of 4:1 to 10:1. And how on earth can we tell by visually looking at them? This information is just such a help to us. So then when you looked at Leachman's profit trend line on one of their indexes, you could see that in the last few years since adopting genomics and genotyping, how much improvement they've been able to gain with higher accuracy selection tools. The same was seen, this is Alison Van Innerham. I'd love to talk on what I saw with her, but it's only a short slot. But she also talked about how genomic selection has rapidly increased genetic improvement in the dairies. Again, we see it in the pigs. So I was lucky enough to go to Lincoln, Nebraska University, and with Benny Moat, and he showed me how in some of the bigger corporations, they've been experiencing massive gains in genetic improvement since using or incorporating genotyping into their EPD or indexes. We saw before with Leachman's the feed efficiency measuring. In Ireland, I saw it actually being done with forage, which is something I hadn't seen anywhere else. And like in South America, the collars again pride in place on the cows, capturing automatically data or phenotypes on those cows. So I was lucky enough, so Pat was an Irish fellow scholar, and I was lucky enough to visit him in his dairy and get to milk some cows. But what was interesting about visiting Pat's dairy is that you can see the ones on the left-hand side are familiar to us in the fact of our indexes in the purple on the visual for Australia, and for Brahmans, you can see the selection index value. And in Ireland, the ICBF or I value or a star rating. And that actually just created so much change in terms of genetic progress for the Irish dairy herd. Now, the red line is fascinating because it's from 10 years later, and the beef farmers are just a bit later in adoption. But as you can see from 2017, they've really escalated in their genetic gain on a similar angle to dairy. So I better keep going, I'm at 18 minutes. So on to rumps and humps. So this is at Jacarezina again, and would you believe they're all Nelore bulls, and they're being fed for sale and some for slaughter. Brazilians viewed beef a bit differently. 80% was consumed in the country, and it was presented differently. So they thought about it, so therefore there weren't as many measures done on it. This was a Nelore Angus cross, and they were off to slaughter that day. Those bulls processed 675 live weight at 20 months, and they apparently dressed 57%. So we're back at Gardner Ranch in Kansas. They can see definite profit in using the tools. So this is Mark Gardner, who's the principal at Gardner Ranch, and he just said, well, why not select the bulls that make you the most amount of money, Becky? And he just said, just use all the tools. And it's something that I've taken on board. You don't have to understand them, but just know that the tools are there. So this is just a personal experience, this one. And that's an example of the steers in the rotation that we had out west on that commercial operation. And we had an average of an MSA marble of 300 and a hump height of 130. So they're Brahmani cattle, but just to point that out. And then we look at this Excel document. I pulled up some data yesterday just to show that we have got cattle that can marble. Andy had a hump height of 130. So an 890 marble with a hump height of 130. It's pretty impressive. So I quickly whipped over to my MSA just to show you the difference there. So at 890, he would have gone an index of 61. And if you look at the average of the mob would have gone 55 at 320. And then the last one there on line 3, if we could improve that marble, we would actually average higher than the Queensland MSA average at 57. So what I know is that there's variation within our breed. But what I want to do is I want to be able to optimize our selections. I don't want to have maximums because we don't want to forego any other traits. But how do we do it? And we just need tools to select. So these here are just some of the research projects that mimic or are similar to what's happening in Australia at the moment. And my key learning from this, our researchers, they do so much worldwide and at home for us, the producer. I'm just wondering if I need to pull up because I'm at 20 minutes, guys.
No, keep rolling.
Okay, I'm nearly there. So then on an industry level, ICBF was just something to behold, and the fact that for 20 years, they've sort of treated it like a marriage where everyone's just put all their information into one database. Now, given when we look at this benchmarking that we do get from that ICBF database, the total cow herd there is 19. So they have a capture by incentivization. So Andrew Cromie said to me, he said, Bec, you know, data's expensive to collect, so why not pay the producer? That's cheaper. So that was an interesting view on that. So back home to Australia and at home with Big Our Cattle with my brother and family. And Mum's an avid Facebook poster, and as you see her with the camera at the start there. But measurement is what we need to be able to manage these traits. So we've been doing our best to capture them. However, sometimes it's not that easy in extensive pastures like we've got. And yeah, it is expensive to get those things, those measurements in. So I really wanted to know, can modern technologies help us measure better in our feedstock operations in Northern Australia, especially in tropically adapted cattle? Because only 70%, there's 70% of bulls sold in the south that have EBVs accompanied with them. However, in the north, we've only got 15%. So we need more measurement to be able to offset that. So these are just some of the modern tech that I saw in my travels and at home. I think that Australia is probably on the front foot with phenotype measuring, and yeah, it was pretty awesome to see. So there's some of the modern tech that I saw helping with phenotype capture. And then in regards to genotype capture, I didn't see much tail hair. Everyone was using TSU, which is happening in Australia. And it still reinforces this graph that I showed at the start. There's no silver bullets. However, measurement can be turned into breeding decisions that will help us with EBVs. So the future, I'll flick through these, but really it's just utilising all the tools that are in our toolbox. We've had those EBVs for nearly 36 years, I think, since they were let out in Australia. We are going to have to look at how we can improve or increase our phenotyping. However, I really value the sire progeny testing that's happening in Australia, especially to measure those expensive and hard to measure traits. So in industry, the education on both is huge. I think that's just an ongoing thing. It's taken me a long time and I'm still trying to get my head around it. However, I see there's lots of potential. The EBV for multi-breed selection is exciting. I do think that there's a big opportunity to be able to use that carcass data set. And if we can put that into selection tools for producers, and the extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, either financially for phenotyping, but also those benchmarking reports. I love the ones we get through my MSA. And the big flash one at the end to roll out, I'd love as a Brahman producer to see an objective indicator of eating quality to align with measurable traits on farm for all breeds. So, and to be paid through our eating quality cipher that we have now, and yield would be pretty cool. So I'll end it there, but I'll thank very much for this opportunity, Nuffield for the experience, and Ugle Bar for having the faith in me and sponsoring me as part of Nuffield. And of course to my family, I would just be lost without them, and the fact that they allowed me to take this time and do this research for industry, and I hope you've gained something out of what I've shared. I'm sorry it was a bit long.
Thanks, Bec. That was awesome. And you've certainly done some miles in that year. So I'm going to throw the floor open to questions now. So we might lead off with a few questions that are in the chat. And then if anyone wants to either type more questions in the chat or verbally ask questions, that's also okay at this point in time. And then just before 1 o'clock, we'll do a quick poll, and then we'll stay on. If you've still got more questions, we can stay on after 1 o'clock. But for those of you that have got to drop out, thanks for joining us today for this excellent session. So the first question is to Jono from Dave Pethick. Beef South Sea work showed that the calpain-calpastatin axis had a powerful effect on improving the consumer score. Is there any progress on it being able to measure these at carcass grading or carcass side in a processor?
Yeah, I'm not sure where that's up to, but obviously if we're going to grade carcasses, we need, if we're going to use any genomic prediction of the yield, of the tenderness, it's got to happen in the chiller. And at the moment it would take a sample and take it back to a lab, run a PCR run, whatever. So the real impediment there is the time, but also the cost. You've got to do the whole chiller full to find the ones that are superior. And so the cost would have to come down to a couple of bucks a head to do that test. But as we're seeing with COVID, we're coming up with more clever tests every day. And maybe we don't have to run a PCR test. Maybe there are other tests that will spin off from some of this area that we can do that on-chain test if it is shown to be able to predict enough differences in tenderness.
And so is there a possibility to do a genomic test for just those few SNPs?
Yeah, I'm sure it is. And then it would have to come down to what technology can be developed and how much of the variation in tenderness does it explain.
Okay, thanks. The next question is from also Jono from Ben Hayes. Lots of students on here today, Jono. So what if market signal for better meat quality is at a country level? For example, overseas customers like Australian beef better than Brazilian beef because they've had a better eating experience with Aussie beef, but there's limited signal at an individual producer level. How do we accommodate that in a selection index to maintain Australia's competitive advantage?
Well, in fact, we can do that now. So we can say that we can put an economic value on marbling, even though in Brahmans we mightn't be paid for it. But we could say we don't want marbling at whatever level we've got now to disappear. So we can make sure that we set the economic value and we put marbling in the index, even though we're not getting paid for it, such that when we select bulls, it doesn't allow bulls that are really crook for marbling to be selected. So we could, and in effect, we do that now for some of the traits, even though we're not being paid for them. They're actually in the index, they've got economic values and they are being considered. But you could also say there are traits like tenderness that we could put an economic value on shear force, even though we're not being paid for it, to make sure when we're making our selections, we don't lose the tenderness we've got now. So I think we can accommodate that. And there's a comment there from Dave Pethick as well, that's in fact what they've done in sheep as well.
Yeah, excellent. I've got a question that was emailed in as well from Jeremy Thompson. What do you see as the major constraints of applying IVF technology in Australia?
I think we'll let Bec answer that one.
I wish I couldn't unmute. I'm probably not much of a person to talk on that, Jono. We do a lot of natural mating and I have done AI, but I feel that a constraint, if you just go off what I've been looking at, would be not having the accuracy of selection tools to be able to accelerate and multiply genetic pools that are inferior. And if we don't have the measurement to be able to let us know what's underneath the skin, then maybe they're not the most profitable animals for Australia. I'm not sure. That would be one of my constraints. But over to you, Jono.
Yeah, well, running any artificial breeding in Northern Australia is costly, and particularly with conception rates. So we've got to lift those conception rates. We've got to work with reproductive biologists and people in that field, because if you run an AI program and get 30% conception or less, then you're really going to be hurting. And so the other constraint often is the cost of semen. The cost of semen for our tropical breeds is exorbitant compared to temperate breeds. And I think that's something we've got to look at in the north, is why are superior genetics or any genetics costing $500, $600, $700 a straw when you can buy the very, very best bulls for cheaper?
$990 this week in the paper for Brahman semen.
Yeah, you could buy the top Angus bull for $45.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it was pretty clear from both your presentations that it's really important to measure. What happens if we do, I guess, select on phenotype? How far wrong can we go in some of those traits if we're not watching the key traits for your production system?
Well, it's like anything. You can go badly wrong. So if you single trait select, then you run the risk of ignoring those other traits. If they happen to be genetically correlated, then you can go down a very slippery path. And what we see in Bec's slides, once you've got those cows in your herd, they're going to be in there for 10 years. And so it takes a long time in beef, particularly with our production systems, to actually turn those mistakes around. So yeah, we've got to be looking at multi-trait selection, no doubt about it. Otherwise we will end up, because in most, as we've shown, there are more than one trait that affects profit. And if you ignore those, then you're going to be doing that at your peril.
There's just a poll there that's popped up that you guys can do while we're answering questions. Another question's just popped in. We put a lot of pressure on the females, but what about male reproductive traits? Are you looking at semen quality and how much impact does that have, or how heritable is that as well?
Yep. So the answer is yes. There is male reproduction traits, and yes, there is genetic variation. we've for a long time had scrotal circumference, but more recently we've now moved into traits like percent normal sperm as an indicator of male fertility. So in terms of calf getting ability, yes, there is genetic variation, and yes, we do have some EBVs, but again, the level of recording, particularly for percent normal sperm, is only fairly limited. But male fertility can affect profitability, and we can improve it again through selection, but also through management.
Just to follow on from Jono, that was the whole motive for my scholarship, is if we put so much selection pressure through management on our females, and we, meat workers, they don't give us a calf every year. However, if we go and put a bull in that doesn't have the genetic potential to keep those daughters in the herd, then we're just sacrificing those females for nothing. And we have put focus or pressure or selection pressure on our scrotal circumference, and we have noticed a huge improvement in our percent normal sperm in our young size, and we also, there's less proximal droplets, so they're reaching puberty, I'd like to think, Jono, correct me if I'm wrong, at an earlier age. So it's sort of nice that through your efforts, you're seeing at first hand those improvements.
Excellent. Another question. We measure hump height as an indicator of Bos indicus content. Can we get smaller hump heights in bulls and still have poor tenderness measures?
Absolutely. So hump height is heritable. It's heritable within breed, but also we have big differences between breeds. And we can use hump height as a pseudo for breed, and therefore we can improve meat quality traits by simply using hump height to say, this is a Brahman versus this is an Angus. But within a breed, hump height does not relate to tenderness. So if you select within Brahmans, you're unlikely to change tenderness. So you can have big hump heights and tender, big hump heights and tough, and vice versa. So we've got to be careful how we use those measures. We can use them in prediction equations to use them as pseudos for breed. But if we're going to then use them in selection, we have to understand what those correlations are within a breed, like Brahmans. And in the repronomics and in CRC, we've got hump height and we've got tenderness, and you can plot those, and you can plot them from the kill, and it's a shotgun. There's no relationship between those two traits.
That's an interesting challenge for us in the MSA world, I guess. So what would a better measure be than hump height?
Eating quality. If we could get all our animals through MSA consumer with more than one cut, with more than one cook, and we can get that data on every single steer, then we would have, we would have a better measure of tenderness.
That's a nice challenge.
Yeah, and
that would be great.
And I can just see Ben said, Ben is saying, should we knock the humps off? Well, the reason Brahmins have a hump is for a 100% reason of fat storage. And I believe that if we change the distribution of fat, we better be very careful that we're also measuring adaptation. And we see very big differences in how a Bos indicus animal and a Bos taurus animal deposits its subcutaneous fat, probably its internal, intra and intermuscular fat, and the hump is another one of those, as Ben points out. And if we simply selected for less hump, we've got to make sure that we're not having an adverse effect on their tropical adaptation.
And it's a question that the industry has been forced to ask themselves as producers, like to hump or not to hump. Pardon the pun, but it, people, do they forego the adaptation? And again, I think it's about optimization or optimal, breeding, what suits your environment, and then, just getting the tools to be able to select, because there's more variation between breeds than within, Johnny, you helped me out with that. But I think that's something to look at.
All right. There's some anecdotal evidence around about the relationship between tenderness and then adaptation or doability, whatever that however you measure that, I guess. But is that a strong negative correlation, or does it even exist?
So those correlations I put up, there didn't tend to be any strong relationship between tenderness and adaptation. But you could understand that, you know, we don't have a lot of measures of adaptation. So we'd have to pull back. Keyshaw Prayaga, CSIRO, published that. I've got all those correlations in front of me, but it's not that strong that we would say we can't have both.
Okay, that's a good thing. All right, is there anyone else want to unmute themselves and throw a question from the floor? Not any. All right. Well, if there's no more forthcoming, then we might draw it to a close there. Thank you so much, Jono and Bec, for your efforts today to pull those presentations together and for the excellent session you just gave. So we really appreciate that. This knowledge is important to get out there, and it's a flow on from questions that people were asking in our other webinars. So everyone was keen on, you know, how do we select for better meat quality if it is important to our consumers from sessions 1 and 2. So yeah, we've got some shared dreams and goals there in terms of better carcass measurement and, you know, cheaper, more accurate measurement to get into these databases to be able to generate better EBVs and line up those genotypes against measured phenotypes as well. So thanks very much for your effort today, and we'll draw it to a close.